China is the emerging military power in Asia. If the United States fights China sometime in the future, it won't be for the first time. In the fall of 1950, the Chinese struck hard at a big American army in Korea. This is a story from the opening battles in that campaign. It's a story about tactics and command and courage and loss. On June 25, 1950, North Korea invaded South Korea. The well-trained and equipped North Korean People's Army, the NKPA, defeated the poorly trained and equipped Army of the Republic of Korea, the ROK, capturing the southern capital Seoul in 3 days. U.S. Army reinforcements began to arrive soon after that. For a month, the NKPA drove the U.S. 8th Army and what was left of the ROK Army south down the peninsula. By early August, the 8th Army and the ROKs held a line around the port of Pusan. For 6 weeks, the NKPA battered at the 8th Army and the ROKs under its command. Then the U.S. 10th Corps landed at Incheon on September 15th and went on to capture Seoul. With its lifeline to the north cut and under pressure from the south, the NKPA retreated deep into North Korea, chased by the 8th Army all the way. By October 24th, the lead units of the 8th Army were deep into North Korea, only 45 miles from the Chinese border at the Yalu River. The U.S. 1st Corps and ROK 2nd Corps were north of the Chongcheng River in the west. The U.S. 10th Corps was along the east coast, near Hungnam. In total, there were around 425,000 Americans and South Koreans. The Americans knew there were strong Chinese forces on the far side of the Yalu, but they thought there were at most 60,000 of them in North Korea. In fact, on the Korean side of the border, there were 180,000 soldiers of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, or PLA, in 6 army groups. On October 25th, the PLA came out of hiding in the forests and hills, attacked the 8th Army, and drove it 30 miles back across the Chongcheng River. They trapped the U.S. 8th Cavalry Regiment at Unsan and tore it apart. Here's how that happened. On November 1st, the 8th Cavalry had about 2,700 soldiers in Unsan, most of them in 3 battalions with about 650 men in each. The 1st Battalion and a platoon of tanks set in just north of the town, in a line a mile and a half long. The 2nd Battalion and a platoon of tanks set in to the west of them in a line about a mile long. There was a mile of open ground between the 2 battalions. A mile and a half to the south was the 3rd Battalion and another platoon of tanks in a line almost 4 miles long. 3 artillery batteries set up to the west and south of Unsan. The 8th Cavalry wasn't expecting much of a fight. They didn't believe the PLA were a real threat, even though the ROK 1st Division just to the east had been fighting them for the last 4 days. The U.S. soldiers thought they would be back on the move soon, so they scraped out shallow foxholes, sent out few patrols, tried to stay warm, and waited for morning. The 8th Cavalry was wrong. The PLA were there in force and well aware of the flaws in the Americans' defenses. Their scouting reports said American sentries were lax and their fighting holes were haphazard, ill-sighted, and undermanned. Just after dark, a PLA regiment with 3,000 men attacked the 1st Battalion. Another PLA regiment with 3,000 men attacked the 2nd Battalion. For 4 hours, the PLA kept attacking. When the Americans were nearly out of ammunition, they decided to pull back down the road to Ipsak. They sent most of their wounded men, support troops, and trucks to the road junction south of town to wait for the infantry to join them after a fighting retreat. A 3rd PLA regiment moved across the river from the 3rd Battalion, but it hung back in the dark without making an attack. Around midnight, a battalion of PLA moved through the gap between the 8th Cavalry's 1st and 2nd Battalions and got into Unsan, while another battalion moved to cut the road to Ipsok 6 miles south of the town. With the PLA behind them, the 1st Battalion loaded its wounded in trucks, put its tanks in the lead, and tried to fight through Unsan. Its infantry companies worked their way around the town on foot and headed for the road junction. Back in the town, without infantry support, the tanks were taken out by the PLA, and the wounded were all captured. The 2nd Battalion left their trucks, tanks, and guns and took off in small groups towards the road junction. Infantry from the 1st and 2nd Battalions joined the trucks waiting on the road, along with 2 batteries of artillery and at least 1 tank, forming a long column that stretched back towards the town. Around 2:30 in the morning of November 2nd, the U.S. column started south. When the lead truck came to the roadblock, the PLA knocked it out. They knocked out the tank behind it. U.S. officers and sergeants tried to organize an attack from the groups of soldiers strung along the road, but none of them would fight. Instead, they left everything behind and headed south cross country. The 3rd Battalion decided to fight, not run. It pulled into a tight defense during the night. PLA raiders got through the lines and hit the battalion command group, but the battalion held. The PLA set up to block help coming from the south. Through the day on November 2nd, 3 U.S. battalions tried to break through to rescue the 3rd Battalion. But one got lost and never got into the fight. A series of company-sized attacks from the other 2 battalions got nowhere. Higher command refused to help with artillery support and at mid-afternoon decided to give up and ordered the 3 battalions to withdraw. The PLA attacked the 3rd Battalion again and again through the next night and again through the one after that. 200 fighting U.S. soldiers protecting 250 wounded men held off a dozen assaults. In that whole time, the 3rd Battalion got no help from the 8th Army. There was no resupply from the air or any help on the ground. By the afternoon of November 4th, it was over. The 3rd Battalion soldiers who could left their fighting holes and headed through the hills to Ipsok, leaving their wounded behind. The battle at Unsan was the first clash between the PLA and the U.S. Army. The PLA had every right to expect a tough battle against soldiers seasoned by 5 months of combat against the NKPA, armed with strong firepower, led by men hard-schooled in war, fighting the Germans and the Japanese only a few years before. But the U.S. forces squandered their advantages with bad tactics and worse command decisions. The PLA mauled the 8th Cavalry. U.S. losses at Unsan were 600 officers and men, 9 tanks, 12 cannon, and 100 trucks. On November 6th, the PLA stopped their attack, pulled back north to hide in the mountains and forests, make good their losses, take on more supplies, and take in the lessons from their fight with the 8th Cavalry. This is what the PLA thought of U.S. soldiers. Cut off from the rear, they abandon all their heavy weapons. Their infantrymen are weak, afraid to die, and have no courage to attack or defend. They depend always on their planes, tanks, and artillery. They are not familiar with night fighting or hand-to-hand combat. They are afraid when the rear is cut off. When transportation comes to a standstill, the infantry loses the will to fight. The PLA was wrong. The last stand of the 3rd Battalion at Unsan should have taught them something about how tough the Americans could be. But their success against the 8th Cavalry's 1st and 2nd Battalions made them confident they could take on the entire 8th Army and beat it. In 3 weeks, They would try again with even stronger forces, and that would bring on the U.S. 2nd Infantry Division's ordeal on the Chong Chong River.